Recently, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers have created a single international trust. Analysts were perplexed because most of the 20th century was marked by the struggle of these two clans. There is an official version where two families allegedly decided to unite in order to survive at a time of instability and international financial crisis. But what really happened? The newly formed union had many oddities. For example, the fact that mega-rich clans united only $40 billion. Such a small amount of money might seem interesting to small fish like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, but not to the biggest sharks of the financial market. To date, the joint budget of the Rothschilds, according to some analysts, exceeds $4 trillion. The fortune of the Rockefeller clan is a little less, only $1 trillion. It turns out that the unification of capital in the world after the crisis is only the tip of the iceberg, in the struggle of some secret elites with others. But if the Rothschild and Rockefeller alliance is preparing to compete with someone, it means that they are not the first largest in the world of the global financial system. So who are they so afraid of, and against whom are they uniting? That's exactly what today's video is about. The founder of the Mayer Rothschild dynasty was born in Germany back in 1744 year, and his American colleague John Rockefeller's sister, almost 100 years later. So, if these are relatively young families in historical perspective, then who was running the financial system of the world? When the Rothschilds and Rockefellers walked under the table on foot, a likely candidate for the role of a shadow hegemon is seen as a family that founded the Standard Chartered Bank back in the distant 1613th year. Real power, secret power, and, as is well known, a lot of money do not like to be talked about. And therefore the Baruchs always tried to stay in the shadows. But even they had to come out into the light. Bernard Baruch, the will of fate, still had to become an advisor on economic issues to several US presidents. It's 1881st year. The Baruch family moves to New York, and young Bernard goes to study at City College, after graduating from which, he begins working as a broker on the New York Stock Exchange, and in 1903 year, organizes his own brokerage company. Despite the fashionable associations in a trust company at that time, Bernard Baruch conducts his very profitable brokerage business, allegedly alone, although undoubtedly, the support of one of the oldest and most influential clans ensures the rise of his career. For the general public, Bernard gets the nickname the Lone Wolf of Wall Street, and at the beginning of the fourth decade, becomes a dollar millionaire while managing to increase his capital in the face of endless crises and turmoil in the US economy. But the most interesting thing begins in 1912, when Baruch plays the political card, financing Woodrow Wilson's election campaign. After the victory, in gratitude for the support, Wilson opens the doors of the US Department of National Defense to Baruch. The First World War, fully organized by the shadow elites, begins, and Baruch becomes the head of the US Military-Industrial Committee, in every possible way stimulating the buildup of weapons, which allows for some time to overcome a series of crises in the United States economy. It was Baruch, who was already an advisor to the president at that time, who persuaded Wilson to support the idea of creating the Fed. And since 1913, the US government has transferred the authority to produce dollar bills to a commercial structure in the Federal Reserve System. Meanwhile, the revolution blossomed in the territory of modern Russia, and Baruch suddenly became an ardent supporter of cooperation with the Soviet Union. Together with Hammer and Harriman, Lenin invites him to restore the national economy of the country of the Soviets, the first of the factories built by Americans in Russia in the 20s and 30s of the last century, were machine-building production facilities in Volgograd, Kharkov, and Chelyabinsk. Of course, these factories had a dual purpose. In addition to tractors, tanks, armored vehicles, and other equipment began to be produced here, which was used in the ranks of the armed forces. The cars that were needed in the army were produced on two main production lines, the Gorky plant and the Likachev plant, which was built on a subsidy from Henry Ford in the 30s. The Americans also financed the construction of two huge steelmaking plants in Magnitogorsk and Kuznetsk. At that time, The situation in the world was developing very dynamically, and, thanks to intuition or insider information, Baruch, with friendly American and British bank owners in the late 20s, carried out a cunning and interesting maneuver. He lobbies for the reorientation of the American economy to service the military-industrial complex, including initiating its artificial collapse and immersion in a sluggish and protracted crisis. He shows his achievements to a very promising British politician, Winston Churchill, whom he invites to America, under the pretext of giving lectures. On October 24, 1929, on the day of the collapse of the New York Stock Exchange, Baruch and Churchill visit Wall Street, at a time when the crowd is raging and indignant in front of the New York Stock Exchange building. He tells Churchill that long before the collapse, he stopped playing on the stock market, sold all his shares, and bought us government bonds instead, saving his capital from depreciation. Churchill was impressed, and since then, their interaction with Baruch has acquired not only a personal character, but also features of a strategic partnership. Baruch and Churchill actively participated in strengthening, and then in the clash of Germany and the USSR. In the same 1933 year, the United States fully establishes diplomatic relations with the USSR, and Bernard Baruch, with well-known Western mastodons of the political arena, meets Soviet plenipotentiaries Maxim Litvinov and Yevgeny Rozengolts in America to discuss a joint line of conduct and further interactions. It is worth remembering that after the revolution, Litvin was the Bolshevik envoy in London, and in December of 1917, wrote a rather strange letter to the British diplomat and Special Services agent Lockhart Trotsky, in which he said that he considered his stay in Russia useful from the point of view of their interests. 1939 year revealed the direct betrayal of the then People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, Litvinov. What authoritative and competent authorities did with traitors of the motherland in those days, they punished, sometimes very severely and suddenly. And what could the all-powerful Stalin, who, according to the memoirs of his contemporaries, spoke at a government meeting about betrayal, hardly keeping calm? In general, nothing grandiose happened. Litvinov was asked to write a statement of his own volition and put under house arrest in a comfortable country residence, and that's it. And the traitor lived to 1951st year, then died safely at the honorable age of 75. It turns out that even Stalin could not dictate his terms to these people. So it's 1934th year. Together with US Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, he made a fantastic deal by exchanging China's gold reserves for a bundle of paper in the form of bonds. Caught in a series of failures, Chiang Kai-shek, suffering one defeat after another, agreed to this exchange. As a result, American bankers received about 100 tons of gold bullion and countless amounts of silver, jewelry, and antiques. And Chiang Kai-shek 250 sheets of paper and a quiet old age on the island of Taiwan. In the early 40s, Baruch had already become a billionaire, but the peak of his enrichment from dirty political games fell during the years of World War II and the post-war nuclear arms race. The Japanese strike on the American naval military base Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941 year, may have been a surprise for someone, but not for Baruch and the US banking elite. It was this provocation that dragged America into World War II, and the oligarchs, first of all Baruch, hit a huge jackpot. During the Second World War, Baruch continued to advise the government and had a serious influence on the distribution of state military orders. Huge fortunes were allocated to finance projects proposed by Baruch. Baruch seriously took up the US nuclear program and first of all crushed the nuclear industry. Baruch wants to rule the world, the moon, and possibly Jupiter, but we'll see about that, President Truman wrote in his diary. This phrase shows well who really made the fateful decisions. And the president could only envy, but he could not openly oppose. Surprisingly, the arbiter of fate did not hide from people, was quite easy to communicate, talked in the park with vacationers, found out what their moods and wishes were, and there was no security near him. Death overtook Baruch in 1965 year. He was buried in an ordinary cemetery on the outskirts of New York. There are no fences, no pompous monuments on his grave, only a modest small slab on the lawn. It is surprising that today there is no information at all about the heirs of Bernard Baruch's trillion-dollar fortune, his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Someone with an almighty hand deleted all the information. There are a huge number of hidden processes in the world, and sometimes it is very difficult for us to figure out who is standing why in the wilds of history. But gradually everything's secret becomes clear. Well, you write in the comments.